When the Focke-Wulf FW-190A first appeared over northern France in August 1941, it struck the Royal Air Force with the force of a revelation. The Spitfire Mk5, Britain's frontline fighter at the time, had dominated Europe since the Battle of Britain, and RAF pilots believed they could handle anything the Luftwaffe sent against them. But the moment the first combat reports came in from squadrons over the Channel, that confidence evaporated. The new German fighter was faster at low and medium altitudes, rolled with impossible quickness, hit harder, climbed aggressively at the start of a fight, and could dive away from danger before a Spitfire could close the gap. RAF pilots, stunned by how quickly it snapped into high-angle rolls or extended out of reach, gave it a name, Butcher Bird. The nickname stuck, and for good reason. In the autumn of 1941 and throughout 1942, the FW-190A outclassed the Spitfire Mk5 across nearly every metric that mattered in a fight. At 15,000 feet, the FW-190A could outrun, outturn, and outdive its British rival. Its wide-track landing gear made it easier to operate from rough French airstrips. Its radial engine absorbed battle damage better than the Spitfire's liquid-cooled Merlin, allowing German pilots to survive hits that would have brought down Allied aircraft. And with its four 20mm cannons paired with two machine guns, the FW-190A delivered a shockingly destructive burst of firepower. RAF squadrons along the Channel front soon found themselves losing pilots at an alarming rate. Tactics that once worked against Bf-109s failed entirely against the new Butcher Bird. Attempts to outturn it often ended in disaster. Attempts to climb away were futile. Even diving was dangerous. The FW-190A's thick wings and rugged structure let it accelerate quickly and safely in steep dives, letting it break contact whenever the situation demanded. The RAF High Command, desperate for answers, rushed new Spitfire variants into production, but it would take months before the Spitfire Mk9, a genuine counter, reached frontline units. During this period, German pilots developed a confidence bordering on invincibility. The Jagdgeschwader flying the FW-190A, JG-2 Richthofen, and JG-26 Schlageter began to see themselves as lords of the French sky. They believed they possessed the best piston-engine fighter in the world, and they were not entirely wrong. From late 1941 through late 1942, the FW-190A was unmatched at its optimal altitude band. Luftwaffe pilots used this superiority mercilessly. Fighter-bomber variants slammed into British coastal towns. Fighter sweeps roamed the Channel at will. Even when the RAF fielded improved Spitfires, the psychological advantage remained with the Germans. This belief in the FW-190A's superiority hardened into doctrine. Many Luftwaffe pilots came to see their aircraft as unbeatable in a traditional dogfight. They believed they could dictate the terms of any engagement, start it, break it, or end it at will. They believed they could always escape by pushing the nose down into a dive or by snapping into a roll that no Allied fighter could follow. And by the time the United States Army Air Forces began arriving in strength in early 1943, that mindset had become entrenched. To German pilots, the arrival of the Americans was no cause for concern. Early encounters with P-38s and P-39s reinforced their confidence. When they first saw the massive, heavy P-47 Thunderbolt taking shape across the Channel, they mocked it openly. It looked too big to maneuver, too heavy to climb, too slow to accelerate. Some Luftwaffe veterans joked that the Thunderbolt was an Einfliegender Kühlschrank, a flying refrigerator. Others said it would be leichtes Fleisch, easy meat. In their minds, nothing could threaten the FW-190A in the altitude band where it had dominated the RAF for 2 years. But the Luftwaffe had made a fatal miscalculation. They were judging the Thunderbolt by its size, not by its design philosophy. They had no idea what the P-47's turbo supercharger would allow it to do at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. No idea how fast it could dive. No idea how hard it could hit with 850 caliber machine guns, and no idea that their beloved Butcher Bird had one critical weakness. Its power and maneuverability collapsed at high altitude, precisely where the Americans intended to fight. The FW-190A's reign as an untouchable predator was drawing to an end. It would not be replaced by a more elegant dogfighter or a more nimble opponent. It would be dethroned by a brute, a monstrous, supercharged, steel-armored beast built not to outturn the enemy, but to overwhelm him with energy, altitude, and unstoppable diving attacks. The Thunderbolt was coming, and the Luftwaffe, still living in the triumphs of 1942, had no idea that the era of the Butcherbird was already beginning to fade. When the first P-47B and P-47C Thunderbolts arrived in England in early 1943, Luftwaffe pilots reacted with open amusement. The aircraft looked absurdly large for a single-engine fighter, an overweight brute with a broad fuselage, thick wings, and a hulking turbo supercharger system that required an entire duct running through the rear of the fuselage. Compared to the sleek Spitfire or the compact, muscular FW-190A, the Thunderbolt seemed almost grotesque. German intelligence officers studying early reconnaissance photos assumed the new American fighter would be sluggish, clumsy, and incapable of matching the nimble German designs that had ruled European skies since 1941. Luftwaffe pilots joked among themselves that the Americans had built a Panzerjäger in der Luft, a tank destroyer in the air, too big to dogfight and too heavy to climb. And to be fair, the early P-47B-C models did little to immediately challenge that perception. Their climb rate was mediocre, their low-altitude acceleration was weak, their handling was unfamiliar to pilots accustomed to light European fighters. Even USAF squadrons initially underestimated what the aircraft could become. Many pilots transitioning from P-40s or Spitfires wondered if they had been given the wrong tool for the job. The Thunderbolt was so massive that pilots joked it needed a crew chief just to help it turn. But the laughter, both American and German, stemmed from the same misunderstanding. No one had yet seen the P-47 in the environment it had been designed for. At low altitude, the Thunderbolt was merely adequate. At medium altitude, it was respectable. But above 25,000 feet, where the USAF intended to wage the strategic air campaign, the P-47 became something entirely different. The secret was its General Electric turbo supercharger, a technological marvel that no other fighter in the European theater possessed. While the FW-190A's BMW 801 radial engine rapidly lost power above 20,000 feet, the P-47's R2800 engine, fed by a massive turbo system that maintained high manifold pressure even in thin air, continued producing full combat power up to and beyond 30,000 feet. Where German fighters gasped for oxygen, the Thunderbolt roared. By mid-1943, as P-47D models entered service in large numbers, German pilots began receiving troubling reports from their colleagues. Interceptions of American bomber streams became more dangerous. Fighters were being bounced from above by Thunderbolts diving at speeds previously thought impossible for a piston-engined aircraft. FW-190A pilots accustomed to dictating combat at 12,000 to 20,000 feet suddenly found that climbing higher exposed them to a new predator, one that did not stall, did not lose power, and did not break up when pushed beyond 500 miles per hour in a dive. This was the first shock. The Thunderbolt owned the vertical dimension of combat. The Luftwaffe's cherished Butcherbird, so dominant at low and medium altitude, simply could not survive when forced upward. At 25,000 feet, the FW-190A's roll rate, one of its greatest strengths, began to fade. At 28,000 feet, its climb rate plummeted. Above 30,000 feet, many pilots described the controls as schwammig, mushy. Meanwhile, P-47 pilots could climb aggressively, dive even more aggressively, and re-engage at will. The second shock came from the Thunderbolt's survivability. German pilots were accustomed to American fighters that could be crippled with a few well-placed 20mm hits. But when FW-190A cannons struck a P-47's radial engine, the results often astonished them. Instead of exploding coolant or seizing instantly, the R2800 kept turning.
Instead of spiraling down in flames, the Thunderbolt held formation or dove away at blistering speed. With armor plate behind the pilot, self-sealing tanks, and a thick radial up front, the P-47 could absorb punishment the FW-190A's designers never expected. More than one German pilot returned to base furious that a leaden monster he had hammered at point-blank range had simply shrugged off the damage and escaped. The third shock came when P-47 units perfected the boom and zoom tactic. German pilots believed that no Allied aircraft could outdive the FW-190A, but the Thunderbolt's weight, clean aerodynamic lines at high speed, and compressibility recovery characteristics proved otherwise. In dives, the Thunderbolt blew past 450 miles per hour with ease, often exceeding 500 miles per hour, speeds that pushed the FW-190A to the brink of structural failure. German pilots trying to chase Thunderbolts in steep dives found themselves shaking violently, wings fluttering, control surfaces stiffening, the entire aircraft threatening to tear apart. The P-47, by contrast, sliced through the air with terrifying stability, the pilot pulling up only when he chose to. And then there was the firepower. The FW-190A's 420mm MG-151 cannons were devastating, but the P-47's 850 caliber Browning machine guns delivered nearly 13 pounds of lead per second, with longer reach and tighter dispersion than German pilots expected. In vertical or slashing attacks, that wall of 50 caliber rounds shredded FW-190As that had no time to evade. As 1943 unfolded, Luftwaffe pilots watched an unsettling pattern take shape. Every engagement with P-47s at medium-high altitude ended the same way. P-47s appeared from above, attacked with overwhelming speed, and vanished before the FW-190A could bring guns to bear. The German pilots accustomed to dominating Spitfires now found themselves unable to dictate the fight. The Invincible Butcherbird, the terror of 1941 to 1942, was meeting an opponent that fought on different terms, an opponent built not to turn tightly, but to rule the battlefield through altitude, energy, resilience, and sheer destructive force. The Thunderbolt was not what the Germans expected, and soon they would learn that it was something far worse. It was a machine they could not catch, could not break, and could not stop from tearing through their formations. The moment of truth came in the summer of 1943, when the Thunderbolt finally entered large-scale combat over Western Europe. For the first few months of the air war, the Luftwaffe's FW-190A units had faced American bombers with little interference from escort fighters. The early P-47s lacked range, limiting them to shallow penetrations into France. But by mid-1943, as drop tanks were introduced and the P-47D fleet expanded, Thunderbolts began appearing deeper, higher, and more frequently over the Reich's industrial arteries. What followed was a rude awakening for the pilots of JG-2 and JG-26, who had grown accustomed to dictating the fight. The first major realization came during the escort missions to Rouen, Antwerp, and the Ruhr. German radar detected high-altitude American formations, B-17s and B-24s. Yet when the FW-190A units surged up to intercept them, they found American fighters waiting above them. This alone baffled the Germans. The Luftwaffe had assumed the P-47 could not climb fast enough, and certainly not high enough to contest the upper altitudes. But USAAF fighters were now patrolling at 28,000 to 31,000 feet, an altitude band where the FW-190A's BMW 801 engine struggled to breathe. The Thunderbolt, empowered by its turbo supercharger, retained full throttle authority in the thin air. Encounters typically unfolded the same way. The FW-190A would rise toward the bomber stream, only to be ambushed from above by diving Thunderbolts. The German pilots tried to break high or snap roll out of danger, tactics that had worked flawlessly against Spitfire MKVEs, but at 25,000 feet and above, the FW-190A's legendary roll rate deteriorated sharply. Control surfaces stiffened, the engine lost torque, every defensive maneuver became sluggish. Meanwhile, the P-47 came down like a thunderbolt, its namesake attack, at speeds exceeding 475 miles per hour, sometimes over 500 miles per hour. The Luftwaffe had never faced a piston fighter that could dive that fast without disintegrating. The result was a series of painful surprises. German pilots reported thunderbolts appearing from seemingly impossible altitudes, striking with tremendous force, and then climbing or leveling off to reposition long before the FW-190A could respond. The Butcher bird had dominated European skies by controlling the vertical. Now the vertical was denied. One German pilot from JG-26 wrote of his shock, "Der Amerikaner schlägt zu und verschwindet, als hätten sie den Himmel für sich allein." The American strikes and vanishes, as if they owned the sky alone. The second shock came when German fighters attempted to pursue the Thunderbolt in a dive. Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized that the FW-190A could disengage from almost anything by diving. It was true at low and medium altitudes, but at altitude, the equation reversed. When FW-190A pilots nosed down aggressively, they found the airframe shaking, the controls stiffening, and compressibility threatening to rip the wings off. Meanwhile, the P-47 tore ahead like a falling anvil, stable and composed. Pursuit became impossible within seconds. The Thunderbolt simply dove into a realm the FW-190A could not follow. This was a devastating psychological blow. The Luftwaffe's premier escape tactic, its safety valve, was now useless. If the Thunderbolt had the advantage, the German pilot could not disengage by diving. If he climbed, he stalled. If he rolled, the controls resisted. If he stayed level, he was a sitting duck. The third shock unfolded during head-on or merging passes. German pilots expected the Thunderbolt to be too sluggish to respond, too slow to accelerate from level flight, but the P-47's enormous R-2800 radial engine and electrically boosted turbochargers gave it astonishing acceleration once the pilot firewalled the throttle. As one JG-2 pilot noted, "Er ist so groß, so schnell zu sein." It is too big to be that fast. And then the fourth shock, survivability. FW-190A pilots shot up Thunderbolts, sometimes pouring 20mm rounds into them, only to watch the American fighter tighten formation or limp home. The P-47's symmetrically cylindrical engine absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any German inline engine. Even when badly hit, Thunderbolts frequently made it back to England. The Luftwaffe rarely saw such resiliency. A pilot could put cannon rounds into a P-47 and still lose the fight. But the worst shock, the one that truly unnerved German pilots, came from the Thunderbolt's boom and zoom dominance. When the P-47 saw an opening, it did not merely attack, it obliterated. The 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns shredded FW-190As in single 1-second bursts. Germans who were used to exchanging fire with Spitfires or P-40s were stunned at how violently their aircraft disintegrated when struck by the concentrated American armament. By autumn 1943, Luftwaffe mission reports consistently noted something they had never written before. FW-190A underlegen by hoher Höhe. FW-190A inferior at high altitude. The Invincible Butcher bird had lost its throne. And German pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt now understood that a new era of air combat had begun, one where altitude, speed, and brutal firepower mattered more than nimble, low-altitude maneuvers. The P-47 had rewritten the rules. As the battles of late 1943 intensified over the Ruhr, Bremen, and Emden and the approaches to Berlin, the Luftwaffe discovered the next horrifying truth about the P-47 Thunderbolt. Not only could the FW-190A no longer dictate altitude, speed, or escape options, it could no longer survive a direct exchange of fire. For 2 years, the FW-190A had held a fearsome reputation as one of the most heavily armed fighters in Europe. Its combination of 4 MG-151/20 cannons and 2 machine guns could rip apart a Spitfire or a P-40 in a single burst.
Pilots trusted that if they reached firing range, the Butcherbird's guns would end the fight quickly. Against the P-47, that expectation collapsed. The Thunderbolt carried 8 Browning AN/M2 50 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, with more than 3,400 total rounds on board. In a 1-second burst, the Thunderbolt delivered nearly 13 pounds of metal, much of it armor-piercing incendiary ammunition, capable of shredding aluminum, rupturing fuel tanks, and detonating critical components. What shocked German pilots most was how tightly these guns grouped their fire at medium distance. A slashing attack from a diving P-47 did not scatter hits, it concentrated them. When those 50 caliber streams connected, the results were catastrophic. FW-190A pilots who once shrugged off minor damage from rifle caliber strikes now watched their wings light up with fire after a single hit. Control surfaces tore off, coolant lines burst. Even the radial engine, famous for toughness, could not withstand multiple API rounds ripping through cylinders and fuel pumps. A Butcherbird struck by a full Thunderbolt salvo often didn't spiral down, it simply came apart. But firepower alone did not break the FW-190A's dominance. It was the combination of firepower, survivability, and energy tactics that reshaped the air war. When an FW-190A tried to turn inside a P-47, the American pilot didn't follow, he climbed. He used the Thunderbolt's altitude advantage and turbo-boosted engine to convert altitude into raw momentum. When he came down again, he wasn't merely returning to the fight, he was bringing a hammer. The Luftwaffe had no answer to these boom-and-zoom tactics. The Bf-109 could sometimes evade by climbing, but the heavier FW-190A lacked the high-altitude performance to escape vertically. Its only real defense, rolling out of danger, was neutered by thin air and fading power at 25,000 to 30,000 feet. German reports from JG-2 and JG-26 repeatedly noted the same events: a Thunderbolt diving from above, attacking at tremendous speed, and pulling up before the FW-190A could turn its nose. More disturbingly, Luftwaffe pilots learned that even when they managed to fire at the P-47, it often did nothing. FW-190A cannon rounds that would have killed a Spitfire instead punched holes in the Thunderbolt that kept flying. The P-47's massive oil-cooled radial engine absorbed punishment. Its thick armor around the cockpit shielded the pilot. Its self-sealing tanks limited damage. A wounded Thunderbolt could dive away at 500 miles per hour and escape every time. A wounded FW-190A could not. Not at high altitude, not with a Thunderbolt behind it. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe began losing experienced aces at a rate that shocked even hardened commanders. Men who had cut down dozens of RAF fighters now found themselves being ambushed by Thunderbolts they never saw until it was too late. P-47 units perfected coordinated top-cover sweeps that waited specifically for FW-190A groups attempting to break into the bomber formations. When the Germans committed, P-47s dropped down like executioners. The FW-190A's famous agility meant nothing when hit from above at closing speeds approaching 800 miles per hour. Pilots had only seconds to react, and those seconds were usually not enough. And then came the West Wall battles and the deep raids on Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Munster. During these operations, P-47 units flew increasingly aggressive penetration escorts. In combat reports from these missions, the same phrase appears again and again. The FW-190 could not climb with us. Not did not, but could not. The Luftwaffe's beloved Butcherbird was trapped, forced upward, away from its strengths, forced to fight in the vertical arena where its engines suffocated, forced to defend industrial targets against an enemy that struck from higher, faster, and harder. Worse still, the Germans learned that every failed interception attempt carried a brutal cost. The FW-190A was a deadly low-altitude fighter, but the air war of 1943 had moved upward, into the realm of the Thunderbolt. And every time the Germans tried to pull the fight back down, the P-47 simply climbed again. The Americans chose the altitude, the Americans chose when to attack, the Americans chose when to disengage. For the first time since 1941, the Luftwaffe was reacting instead of dictating.
and German pilots who once laughed at the Thunderbolt's size now whispered about it with caution. The P-47 was not elegant, it was not graceful, it was not a dueling partner. It was a sledgehammer. And the FW-190A, once the terror of Europe, had no way to block the blow.
By the end of 1943, the Luftwaffe could no longer deny the truth. The era of the FW-190A's dominance was over. What had begun 2 years earlier as a reign of total superiority, when the butcher birds sliced through Spitfires with impunity, had now transformed into a daily struggle simply to survive the high-altitude battlefield carved out by the United States Army Air Forces. Every major combat report, every group and commandeur briefing, every pilot debrief pointed to the same grim reality. The FW-190A had met an enemy it could not defeat on the terms the war now demanded. The high-altitude strategic campaign changed everything. Germany's war effort required defending factories, oil plants, rail hubs, ball bearing facilities, and aircraft works scattered across the heartland. These targets drew American heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, that operated at altitudes where the FW-190A was weakest. The Thunderbolt, by contrast, came alive in the thin air. Its turbo supercharger allowed it to deliver full power at 30,000 feet. Its rugged airframe let it dive at speeds the FW-190A dared not attempt. Its 8.50 caliber guns shredded German fighters in the brief windows where the FW-190A entered firing range, and its survivability meant that even damaged Thunderbolts returned home, while damaged German fighters vanished into the clouds trailing fire. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They introduced the FW-190A5, A6, A7, and A8. They experimented with high-altitude modifications, different propeller hubs, new superchargers, but each new version only added weight without solving the central problem. The BMW 801 engine simply could not match American turbo supercharging at high altitude. Even when boosted with MW50 or GM1 injection, the FW-190A still choked above 25,000 feet. Pilots noticed the same symptoms again and again: mushy controls, fading climb rate, and insufficient acceleration in the vertical. None of these flaws mattered in 1941-42. In 1943, they were fatal. The psychological toll was equally devastating. In early 1943, German pilots still carried the swagger of that earlier era. They believed deeply in the FW-190A's superiority. They mocked the Thunderbolt, dismissing it as a flying bulldozer. But after the battles of Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, and Munster, that confidence evaporated. Luftwaffe units that once expected to lose one pilot for every 5 or 6 enemies destroyed now faced the opposite: one German loss for every Thunderbolt damaged. Veterans who had survived dozens of fights against Spitfires found themselves dying in their first engagements against P-47s they never even saw coming. The debriefings revealed the psychological shift. Pilots described Thunderbolts materializing aus dem Nichts, out of nowhere, from altitudes they believed unreachable. Others reported Thunderbolts surviving direct cannon hits. Many wrote of the same helpless sensation: climbing and watching the Thunderbolt climb faster, diving and watching the Thunderbolt dive harder, turning and watching the Thunderbolt simply ignore the turn and reset for a new attack. The Luftwaffe's entire doctrine, control the vertical, dictate the engagement, disengage by diving, had been stripped from them. By late 1943, JG-2 and JG-26, once the elite guardians of Western France, were no longer cohesive high-altitude defense forces. They were reactionary units fighting to hold back a tide they could not control. Every mission became a gamble: attack the bombers and risk being ambushed from above, or hold altitude to avoid the P-47s and allow the bombers to proceed unchallenged. It was a lose-lose scenario. The Butcher Bird still had teeth. At low altitude, in the hands of veteran pilots, it remained one of the most dangerous fighters in the world. But the battlefield of 1943 was no longer thought there. The war had moved upward, into the realm where turbo superchargers ruled, where altitude was life, where speed in a dive was decisive,
where 8.50 caliber guns could rip steel apart. In that new world, the FW-190A could not survive. The Luftwaffe command reluctantly acknowledged this truth. Internal memos noted the Überlegenheit des P-74 in grosser Höhe, the superiority of the P-47 at great altitude, and the need for entirely new aircraft to counter it. The FW-190A's successor, the high-altitude FW-190D, Dora, was rushed into production precisely because the A model had failed against the Thunderbolt. For the pilots who believed the FW-190A was invincible, 1943 was the year their illusion died. They entered the summer full of confidence and contempt for American fighters. They ended the year staring upward, scanning the sunlit altitudes for the silhouette of a monster they had once mocked. And somewhere up there, always above them, always with the advantage, flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the unstoppable hammer that shattered the legend of the Butcherbird.